The stitch marks under the chin were the first thing that didn't make sense. But when you are working the third shift in a basement archive filled with moldering police records, the mind plays tricks to keep itself awake. Evelyn rubbed her eyes, the harsh fluorescent light overhead humming a low, maddening B-flat. She was 27, drowning in student debt, and had taken this temporary data entry job for the city archives because it promised isolation. She wanted isolation. For the past 6 months, since the funeral, the sound of other people's voices had begun to feel like sandpaper on her raw nerves. Before her lay a water-damaged manila folder from 1974, recovered from a condemned municipal building in Taipei before it was demolished. Most of the files were mundane property disputes and tax ledgers, but this one was different. It contained a series of translated interviews and a single, grainy black and white photograph. In the photo sat a doll. It was crude, handmade from heavy white canvas, its head disproportionately large and perfectly round. It had no mouth. 2 simple black beads served as eyes, staring blankly into the camera lens. Attached to its left ear was a stiff, dark ribbon. But it was the throat that made Evelyn lean closer, her breath fogging the protective plastic sleeve. Someone had taken thick, black twine and sewn the head to the body with agonizingly tight, uneven stitches. The fabric around the neck was stained a dark, crusty brown that time had faded but not erased. According to the translated log, a woman named Lin had been arrested after neighbors reported a foul odor coming from her cramped apartment in the Wanhua district. When the authorities broke down the door, they found the apartment stripped bare. No furniture, no clothes, no food. Just walls covered in hundreds of sheets of parchment paper, each one bearing the same hand-drawn image of the mouthless cat. And in the center of the room, Lin sat on the floor, her fingers raw and bleeding, cradling the heavy canvas doll. Her 12-year-old daughter, who had been diagnosed with terminal throat cancer 6 months prior, was missing. Lin insisted the girl was safe. She insisted the bargain had been kept. Evelyn sighed, a dry, raspy sound in the quiet room, a tragic case of a mother losing her mind to grief. It was an old story, universal and deeply sad. She began typing the case summary into the database. File 74B, Lin Meihui, psychiatric commitment. As her fingers hit the keys, the overhead fluorescent bulb flickered. A sharp, metallic pop echoed through the basement, and for a fraction of a second, the room plunged into total darkness. In that heartbeat of shadow, Evelyn smelled something. It wasn't the familiar, comforting scent of old paper and dust. It was wet, a heavy, iron-rich stench, like copper pennies left to sit in stagnant water, mingled with the faint, sweet rot of decaying meat. The light snapped back on with a loud buzz. Evelyn gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked around the long row of steel shelves. Nothing, just the shadows stretching out into the dark corners of the basement. She took a deep breath, trying to rationalize the odor away. The building's plumbing was ancient. A backed-up sewer line could easily mimic that smell. She turned back to the desk to finish the entry, but her hand froze over the keyboard. The photograph inside the plastic sleeve looked different. The angle was slightly altered, as if the camera had been moved an inch to the right. But what made Evelyn's stomach drop was the doll's head. It was no longer perfectly upright. It was tilted a fraction of a degree toward the lens, and the thick, black twine at the neck looked tighter, pulling the fabric taut, as if something inside the doll was pushing upward against the stitches. Evelyn shut the folder hard, the slap of cardboard echoing like a gunshot in the empty basement. "You're tired," she told herself. "You're seeing things." She logged out of her terminal, grabbed her coat, and left early. The cold autumn air outside felt like a splash of water to her face, but the unease didn't wash away. It followed her onto the subway. The train was mostly empty, the rhythmic clack-clack of the tracks usually a soothing white noise. But tonight it sounded like words, a rhythmic, choked whisper. "Hello, hello." She got off at her stop and walked quickly toward her apartment, a modest third-floor walk-up in an old brick building. The streetlights cast long, shivering shadows through the bare tree branches. As she walked, she felt a heavy, oppressive sensation between her shoulder blades, the unmistakable prickle of eyes on her back. She stopped and turned around. The street was empty. A lone plastic bag tumbled across the asphalt in the wind. When she reached her apartment, she locked the door, sliding the deadbolt into place with a comforting thud. She threw her keys on the counter and walked into the bathroom to wash her face. She turned the tap, splashing cold water over her skin. When she stood up and wiped her eyes with a towel, she looked into the mirror. There, on the glass, written in the condensation of her own breath that hadn't even fully formed yet, was a small, crude circle. 2 dots for eyes. No mouth. Evelyn reeled back, her heel catching on the bath mat. She slammed against the wall, her eyes wide. She stared at the mirror. The drawing was gone. The glass was perfectly clear, reflecting only her own pale, terrified face and the white subway tile behind her. "Get a grip," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's just stress. It's just the anniversary." Tomorrow would mark exactly 6 months since her sister's death. The grief was turning into something malignant, twisting her perception. She decided to go straight to bed. She pulled the covers up to her chin, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that felt miles away. The apartment was profoundly quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on your eardrums. Around 3 a.m., the silence broke. It was a soft, wet sound coming from the living room. Schlick, schlick. It sounded like someone pulling a wet string through tight canvas. Evelyn froze under the blankets, her muscles locking with primal terror. She strained her ears. The sound stopped, then a slow, dragging noise, something heavy being pulled across the hardwood floor. Drag, pause, drag. It was moving from the kitchen toward her bedroom door. Evelyn reached out, her hand shaking violently, and grabbed her phone from the nightstand. She turned on the flashlight and aimed the beam at the bedroom door. The crack beneath the door was dark. She watched, her breath caught in her throat, as a shadow fell across the threshold. Something was standing right outside. Then came the voice. It didn't come from the hallway. It came from inside her own head, but it sounded like it was being filtered through a throat full of wet sand. It was a raspy, airless gasp, trying desperately to form words without the anatomy to do so. HHH, LLL, oh. Evelyn let out a choked cry and threw herself out of bed, lunging for the door. She grabbed the handle, flung it open, and shone the flashlight into the living room. There was nothing there. The living room was exactly as she had left it. Her keys were on the counter. Her coat was on the chair. But as she panned the flashlight beam across the floor, she noticed something near the entryway. On the dark hardwood, there was a faint, glistening trail. It looked like thick, clear saliva mixed with a trace of dark, oxidized blood. It started at the front door, wound its way through the kitchen, and stopped right where she was standing. She followed the trail backward with the light. When the beam hit the front door, she noticed a small, white shape sitting on the floorboards, wedged into the corner by the umbrella stand. Evelyn approached it like someone walking toward an unexploded bomb. It was a small plush toy, a white cat with a pink bow over its left ear. It was modern, commercial, clean. The kind of toy you could buy at any mall in the world. But it didn't belong to her. She didn't own anything like that. She knelt down, her heart hammering in her throat, and picked it up. The plush felt unnaturally heavy, dense, like it was filled with damp earth instead of polyester stuffing. She turned it over in her hands. The toy had no mouth, just 2 black plastic eyes that caught the flashlight beam, reflecting 2 perfect points of cold light. Evelyn dropped it. It hit the floor with a dull, heavy thud that sounded entirely wrong for a stuffed animal. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She sat on her sofa with all the lights turned on, her eyes fixed on the little white toy across the room. It didn't move. It just sat there, its blank face staring up at the ceiling. By morning, the paranoia had hardened into an obsession. Evelyn skipped work. She sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open, frantically searching foreign databases, obscure forums, and digitized occult archives. She translated pages from Taiwanese urban legend blogs, her fingers flying across the keyboard, a cold sweat dampening her collar. The pieces began to fit together into a shape that horrified her. The legend wasn't about a cute cartoon character. The cartoon was a skin, a corporate mask painted over an ancient, weeping wound. The story spoke of a mother in the 1970s whose daughter was dying of a cancer that was eating away her throat, leaving her unable to speak, suffocating on her own blood. Desperate, the mother made a pact with something that answers from the dark, a deity of silence, an entity that demands a heavy price for a life. The bargain was simple. The child's life would be spared, but her voice, and the voices of those who looked upon the vessel, would belong to the dark. The entity required a vessel that could not speak, a symbol of the eternal silence bound by the pact. A creature with no mouth. To create the vessel, the mother had to stitch the head onto the canvas body using a thread dipped in her own daughter's dying blood. The corporate entity that later bought the design didn't create a character. They commercialized a curse, spreading millions of miniature vessels across the globe, inviting the mouthless thing into a billion homes. Evelyn stared at the screen, her eyes bloodshot. "It's a lie," she whispered to the empty room. "It's just an urban legend." But then she remembered the photo in the archive. The dark stains on the canvas, the stitch marks. She looked over at the plush toy on the floor. It was closer. It was no longer by the umbrella stand. It was sitting in the middle of the rug, perfectly centered, its blank face turned directly toward the kitchen table where she sat. A sudden, sharp cramp seized Evelyn's throat. She coughed, a dry, hacking sound. She reached for her glass of water and swallowed, but the water felt like liquid fire sliding down her esophagus. She coughed again, harder this time, stumbling to the sink. She spat. A thick, dark glob of blood hit the porcelain. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She grabbed the plush toy from the floor. Felt warm now, warm and slightly soft, like flesh. She ran out of the apartment, down the stairs, and out into the alley behind her building where the large commercial dumpster sat. She threw the toy into the deep, dark belly of the dumpster, slamming the heavy plastic lid shut. "Stay there," she sobbed, her voice breaking, sounding horribly thin and raspy. "Stay there." She ran back upstairs, locked her door, and dragged a heavy armchair in front of it. She was safe. It was just a toy. It was just a coincidence that her throat hurt. She had caught a cold. The mold in the basement archive had irritated her lungs. She went into the bedroom, pulling the blinds shut, plunging the room into twilight. She lay on the bed, curling into a ball, squeezing her eyes shut. She tried to think of her sister, tried to find comfort in her memory, but all she could see was the photo of Lin Meihui, sitting on the floor of a stripped-bare apartment, bleeding from her fingers. Hours passed. The sun set and the room grew dark. Evelyn woke to a sensation of extreme cold. The air in her bedroom was freezing, her breath rising in pale plumes before her. Then came the smell, the copper, the wet, sweet rot. It was overwhelming, filling her nostrils, making her gag. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat felt entirely blocked, as if it were packed tight with thick, wet wool. She reached up to her neck, her fingers trembling. The skin beneath her chin felt rough, rigid. She scrambled out of bed and rushed to the bathroom, her hands fumbling wildly for the light switch. The overhead light flickered to life, buzzing angrily. Evelyn looked in the mirror. A line of thick, black twine was embedded in the flesh of her throat. It ran in an uneven, agonizing circle all the way around her neck, cutting deep into the skin. The flesh around the stitches was puckered and purple, weeping a dark, clear fluid. As she stared in horror, she felt a sharp, agonizing tug from inside her throat. The twine tightened. The stitches pulled closer together, crushing her windpipe, forcing her head down toward her chest. She opened her mouth to scream for help, to cry out to the empty apartment, but her jaws wouldn't part. Her lips felt heavy, fused together. She looked closer in the glass. The pink line of her lips was fading, the skin smoothing out, blending together into a seamless, unbroken expanse of pale flesh. She was losing her mouth. A soft sound came from behind her. Schlick, schlick. Evelyn turned around slowly, her vision blurring, her lungs screaming for oxygen that could no longer find a way in. Sitting on the edge of the bathtub was the plush toy. It was no longer small. It was the size of a young child, its heavy, round canvas head tilting slightly to the left. The black plastic eyes reflected the flickering bathroom light, vast and completely empty. The thick black stitches around the toy's neck began to unravel, one by one, popping open with a wet snap. The heavy white head shifted, tilting backward, revealing the hollow, pitch-black void inside the canvas body. From the darkness within the doll, something reached out. Not hands, but long, thin threads of wet, black twine, writhing like a nest of worms. They reached toward Evelyn's bleeding neck, seeking the loose ends of the stitches in her flesh. The bathroom light flickered violently, then snapped, plunging the room into absolute darkness. In the dark, there was no scream. There was only the wet, rhythmic sound of a needle being pulled through tight canvas, and a faint, suffocating gasp that sounded like an echo from a basement 50 years away. HHH, LLL? Oh. The next morning, the city archive building remained quiet. Evelyn's terminal sat dark. In her apartment, the armchair remained firmly wedged against the front door. Inside, the rooms were perfectly still, stripped of any sound, leaving only a small white plush toy sitting on the unmade bed, its black eyes staring at the door, waiting for someone to find it. The silicon didn't melt. It rotted. Marcus learned the smell of decaying electronics long before he understood what was causing it. It was a sharp, chemical stench that clung to the back of the throat, resembling battery acid mixed with old, stagnant dishwater. For a 34-year-old freelance archivist specializing in early 90s source code and hardware preservation, that smell usually meant a tragic loss of data. But lately, it had begun to feel like an invasive species taking over his apartment. He sat in the glow of 3 mismatched CRT monitors, his fingers tapping in a regular rhythm against the plastic casing of a modified 1993 Sega Genesis. Outside, a miserable November rain dragged itself down the window panes of his second-floor flat, matching the persistent hum of the cooling fans inside. Marcus was tired. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened into bruises over the last fortnight, a physical receipt for the obsessive hours he was pouring into his latest acquisition. It was an unlabeled, matte black developer cartridge. No sticker, no official stamp, just a hand-scrawled serial number on a piece of yellowing masking tape. 00-00-00. He'd bought it from an estate sale in Seattle belonging to a reclusive Sega Technical Institute engineer who had died alone in his basement, unnoticed for 3 weeks. "Come on, you piece of garbage," Marcus muttered, his voice raspy from lack of sleep and too many cheap cigarettes. He flipped the power switch on the console. The television screen crackled with static electricity, pulling the fine hairs on Marcus's forearms toward the glass. The familiar, nostalgic Sega chime didn't play. Instead, the audio engine produced a low, resonant drone that vibrated through the floorboards, a digital groan that felt far too deep for a 16-bit sound chip to generate. The title screen finally flickered into view. It was the iconic blue hedgehog, arms crossed, spinning in his golden ring against a checkerboard sky. But the rendering was fractured. The colors were oversaturated, the sky a bruised, twilight violet rather than the bright, crisp blue Marcus remembered from his childhood. The water in the background didn't cycle its pixels smoothly. It stuttered, freezing for seconds at a time before jerking forward. Marcus leaned closer, the static heat of the monitor warming his face. "Graphic corruption in the VRAM," he murmured to himself, reaching for his notebook to log the anomaly. "Palette mapping is completely inverted in the lower register." He pressed start. The game didn't transition to the level selection or the standard introductory stage. The screen went black, and the drone shifted into a cyclical, metallic scraping sound, like iron being dragged over wet concrete. 3 names appeared on the save selection screen, written in the standard system font, but their sprites, the familiar sidekicks, were completely motionless. They didn't breathe, their digital eyes staring blankly out of the screen, fixed not on the virtual horizon, but forward, toward the glass, toward Marcus. Choosing the first character, Marcus pressed the button. The controller felt uncomfortably cold in his palms, the plastic grease from decades of storage giving it a slimy, organic texture. The level loaded. The title card simply read, Hill. It was a mockery of the famous first stage. The green grass had been replaced by a uniform, muddy brown texture that looked poorly compressed, almost like dried mud or rusted metal. The music was gone. In its place was the ambient background noise of a wind tunnel, a hollow, rushing whistle that seemed to fluctuate based on how fast Marcus moved the character forward. The physics engine is intact, Marcus whispered. His analytical mind fighting the creeping sense of unease settled in his stomach. But where are the assets? Where are the enemies? He ran the character to the right. The screen scrolled. The background hills were empty, their iconic palm trees stripped of their leaves, standing like jagged, broken teeth against an unchanging, dark gray sky. Then the sprite stopped moving. Marcus pushed the D-pad hard to the right. The controller clicked, but the character remained stationary. In the center of the screen, the blue hedgehog appeared. But it wasn't the player sprite. It was an idle animation Marcus had never seen in any retail release or prototype dump. The character was facing away from the camera, its quills twitching with a strange, sub-pixel stutter that made it look less like an animation and more like a captured video of something shivering from the cold. Is this a rendering bug? Marcus asked the empty room. He stood up, his knees popping in the silence. He walked over to the console, intending to check the cartridge connection. But as his hand hovered over the plastic, a sound emerged from the television speakers. It was a laugh. It wasn't the compressed, scratchy digital chuckle used in the retail games. It was a clean, uncompressed audio file. A wet, breathless giggle that sounded like it had been recorded through a cheap telephone receiver. It didn't come from the left or right speaker. It seemed to resonate from the center of the cathode ray tube itself. Marcus recoiled, his hand snapping back. On the screen, the blue character slowly turned around. The sprite design was wrong. The eyes weren't white. They were a deep, void-like black, with two tiny, burning red pixels in the center that didn't stay aligned with the sprite's movement. They jittered independently, like the eyes of a frantic insect. Below them, the mouth was fixed in a wide, unrealistic smile that stretched past the margins of the face, exposing a row of jagged, gray pixels that looked like broken glass. The screen flashed red for a single frame, so fast Marcus wasn't sure he'd actually seen it, and then the monitor went black. The hum of the console died. Marcus stood in the center of his dark apartment, the only light coming from the street lamps outside reflecting through the rain-streaked windows. The smell of rotting silicon was stronger now, thick and cloying, filling the small room until he felt dizzy. He reached down, pulled the plug from the wall, and left the console dark. He tried to go to sleep, but the silence of the flat felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over deep water. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those two independent red pixels burning behind his eyelids. He could hear his refrigerator humming in the kitchen, but the rhythm felt wrong. Kept dropped into that low, mechanical scraping sound from the game. By 4 a.m., the paranoia had settled deep into his chest. He felt an overwhelming sensation of being watched, not from the window or the door, but from the shelf where the black cartridge sat. It was an irrational, childish fear, the kind he hadn't felt since he was 7 years old, afraid of the dark corner of his closet. "You're a grown man," he muttered, throwing off his blanket. "It's an unreleased build with corrupted sound files and a creepy hacker aesthetic. That's all it is." He walked back into the living room, plugged the console back in, and sat down. He didn't turn on the lights. He needed to dump the ROM to see the hexadecimal code with his own eyes. If he could see the code, he could understand it. If he could understand it, it would stop being frightening. He connected his ripping rig to his PC, inserted the cartridge, and initiated the dump. The progress bar on his computer monitor crawled forward. 10%, 20%. Then the software errored out. Error. Sector 0x00F3 inaccessible. Logic corruption detected. Marcus frowned, opening a hex editor to look at the data that had been pulled. He scrolled through the lines of code, the endless blocks of letters and numbers that defined the boundaries of that digital world. He stopped. Deep within the code, where the text strings for menu options and credits usually lived, the letters didn't form standard engine commands. They formed sentences. They were written in English, repeated thousands of times, buried beneath the graphic data. Little lungs to run, little feet to tires. The glass is thin, Marcus. Marcus stared at his name on the monitor. The room grew intensely cold, his breath suddenly visible in the bluish light of the computer screen. His heart violently thudded against his ribs. Marcus. It was a common name, he reasoned. The previous owner, the engineer who died, could have been named Marcus. Or maybe it was a coincidence. A terrifying, impossible coincidence. Before he could process the thought, the Sega Genesis turned itself on. The power switch didn't move. The plastic toggle remained in the off position. But the red LED on the front of the console flared to life, burning with an intensity that seemed to melt the surrounding plastic. The television screen didn't display the game. It displayed a direct live feed of Marcus's living room, taken from an angle that shouldn't exist, high up in the corner near the ceiling, where nothing but a water stain lived on the wallpaper. In the video, Marcus could see the back of his own head, his shoulders hunched over the computer. But on the television screen, there was something else in the room with him. Standing directly behind his chair was a tall, unnaturally thin shape. It was blue, but the texture looked like wet felt that had been left to rot in a basement. Its arms were impossibly long, the fingers ending in blunt, pixelated nubs that twitched against the fabric of Marcus's jacket. The head was oversized, tilted at a 90-degree angle, the wide, gray-toothed smile inches away from Marcus's real-world neck. Marcus scrambled backward, screaming, throwing his chair over. The chair crashed against the floorboards, but when he looked at the dark corner of the room, there was nothing there, just his coat hanging on the door. He looked back at the television. The feed was still live. On the screen, the creature was now looking directly at the camera angle, its insect-like red eyes locked onto Marcus's position on the floor. It raised one long, trembling arm and tapped its blunt finger against the inside of the television screen. Tap, tap, tap. The sound didn't come from the speaker. It came from the glass itself. Physical vibrations rattled the front of the CRT monitor. "What do you want?" Marcus choked out, his throat dry, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended reality. He was looking at a ghost in the machine, a digital infection that had found a way to bridge the gap between software and flesh. The screen flickered. The live feed vanished, replaced by the save selection screen from before. The first character slot was now gone, replaced by a grayed-out icon of a weeping, broken figure. The second character slot was highlighted. The metallic scraping sound returned, louder now, vibrating through Marcus's teeth, making his skull ache. The console was hot, the smell of melting copper and burning plastic filling the room until he could barely breathe. He realized then that the game wasn't running on the hardware anymore. The Sega Genesis was unplugged from the wall. He could see the black cord lying coiled on the carpet like a dead snake. The machine was running on something else. It was running on his attention. It was feeding on his isolation, his obsession, his fear. "I'm not playing," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He grabbed a heavy metal paperweight from his desk and stepped toward the television. "I'm breaking this damn thing." He raised the iron weight, intending to shatter the glass tube, to bleed the vacuum out of the monitor and end the nightmare. The screen flashed a blinding, brilliant white. Marcus dropped to his knees, his hands flying to his ears as a high-pitched, agonizing squeal tore through the room. It was the sound of data corruption amplified to a deafening volume, a digital shriek that felt like a physical blade entering his ear canals. He rolled onto his side, his eyes squeezed shut, blood trickling from his nose onto the cold hardwood floor. Through the roar in his ears, he heard the glass crack. It wasn't a sharp snap. It was a slow, splintering sound, like ice groaning under a heavy weight. Marcus forced his eyes open. The television screen was webbed with fractures, but the glass hadn't fallen outward. Something was pushing out from the inside. The heavy, curved surface of the CRT monitor was bulging, the glass stretching like molten plastic, forming the distinct, rounded shape of a snout, then a pair of pointed, triangular ears. Two small, pinprick red lights burned through the cracked, milky distortion of the glass. The smell of rotting silicon was gone, replaced instantly by the suffocating, ancient odor of an open grave. The temperature in the room plummeted until the moisture on Marcus's eyelashes began to freeze. The stretched glass mouth opened. There were no teeth inside, only a shifting, infinite vortex of scrolling hexadecimal code, millions of red characters spinning in a void, screaming in a language made of math and misery. Marcus tried to crawl away, his fingers scratching uselessly against the floorboards, but his limbs felt heavy, like they were being rendered at a lower frame rate. His movements were jerky, disjointed, his body failing to respond to his brain's frantic commands. He looked down at his hands. The edges of his fingers looked blurred, blocky, the skin tones shifting into a limited palette of grays and sickly flesh tones. The entity in the screen didn't reach out with hands. It reached out with sound. A wave of that clean, uncompressed, wet laughter washed over Marcus, paralyzing him completely. It filled his thoughts, erasing his memories of his childhood, his sister, his work, replacing everything he had ever known with a singular, terrifying realization. The digital world wasn't a creation of man. It was a window that had been opened, and something had been waiting on the other side since the dawn of time, waiting for the technology to grow advanced enough to let it crawl through. "Please," Marcus whispered, though he could no longer feel his lips moving. The red eyes in the glass widened. The text scrolling inside the creature's mouth slowed down, organizing itself into a final, readable line of code across the expanse of his dying consciousness. "You are the tracks now, Marcus. Run." The glass finally shattered, but no shards hit the floor. The vacuum pulled inward, and with it, the light in the room died completely. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving the city wrapped in a thick, gray fog. The landlord found the apartment 3 days later, following the complaints of a strange, chemical odor coming from beneath the door. When the police entered, they found the flat entirely empty of life. There were no signs of a struggle. Marcus's clothes were still in the closet, his wallet on the counter, his phone still charging on the desk. The only anomaly was the state of his electronics. Every monitor, every computer, and every console had been completely hollowed out. Their internal components melted into a single solidified puddle of black plastic and copper on the floorboards. The old television in the corner was the only thing intact, though its screen was deeply cracked, the glass clouded and cold. A technician from the forensic unit later took the television back to the lab to see if it could be used to retrieve any security footage from the external drives. When he plugged it into the test bench, the unit didn't explode or smoke. The screen remained black, but deep within the fractured glass, a tiny, faint icon flickered into view in the bottom corner. It was a new character select sprite. It was a 34-year-old man, rendered in crude, 16th-bit color, his eyes replaced with 2 dead, black pixels, his digital hands pressed flat against the inside of the screen, completely motionless. The technician didn't see it. He logged the television as non-functional, turned off the bench light, and locked the door to the lab, leaving the silent figure in the glass to stare out into the dark, empty room forever. The nitrate didn't burn. It wept. Arthur knew the chemical volatility of early cinema stock better than he knew the layout of his own apartment, but he had never encountered a reel that sweated a fluid resembling stagnant grease. It stained the cotton of his restoration gloves a sickly, translucent yellow, carrying an odor that didn't belong in a temperature-controlled vault. A heavy, organic stench of wet feathers and salt. At 41, Arthur was the chief restoration technician for a private archive in Los Angeles, an underground facility where the air was always 50 degrees and smelled faintly of vinegar. His life was a quiet succession of frames, sprockets, and light tables. Since his divorce 2 years ago, he had grown to prefer the company of dead actors and silent ghosts. They were predictable. They stayed exactly where the celluloid held them, until the unlabeled tin arrived from an anonymous estate in France. It was an oxidized canister of 35mm film, its lid sealed with brittle, black electrical tape that crumbled into soot under his tweezers. The handwritten label on the metal had long since faded into an illegible gray smudge, leaving only a scratch that looked like a jagged tooth. Probably another discarded French newsreel from the 20s. Arthur muttered to his assistant, David, who was busy cataloging glass plates across the room. "Do we have a budget line for it?" David asked without looking up, his voice muffled by his respirator mask. "No, but the donor paid the intake fee in cash. I'll dump it onto the flatbed scanner tonight just to see if the base is stable enough for a chemical bath." When David left at 6, the subterranean archive became profoundly still. The only sound was the cyclical, hydraulic gasp of the ventilation system. Arthur mounted the mystery reel onto his Steinbeck editing table. The film was brittle, its edges warped from decades of improper storage, but the silver halide emulsion remained remarkably intact. He flipped the toggle switch. The motor whined, a rhythmic thwip-thwip-thwip that usually comforted him. He leaned over the small, illuminated glass screen of the viewer. The short cartoon didn't begin with a title card or a copyright notice. It opened on a stark, black-and-white background, a poorly rendered city street where the buildings didn't conform to proper perspective. They leaned inward, their windows blocky and black, like empty eye sockets. Then the mouse walked into frame. It was an early incarnation of the global icon, but the proportions were subtly, disturbingly wrong. The ears were too large, sagging slightly under their own digital weight, and the iconic white gloves were missing, revealing black, flat stumps for hands. The character's head was tucked down toward its chest, its shoulders slumped in a posture of profound, physical exhaustion. The loop was short. The mouse simply walked from left to right past 6 identical buildings, the background repeating itself every 9 seconds. There was no music. The audio track was a continuous, low-frequency hum, overlaid with the sporadic sound of someone striking a piano key with a dead finger, a flat, resonant clunk that occurred at irregular intervals. Arthur slowed the playback, his thumb on the manual jog wheel. "The animation cycle is sloppy," he murmured, his eyes scanning the frame line. 6 frames for the stride, but the hip joint isn't anchored. It looks like it's dragging its lower half. He noticed something strange on the 3rd building in the background. A smear of gray on the sidewalk that hadn't been there in the 1st frame. He moved the film forward frame by frame. The smear wasn't a smudge on the lens. It was a figure, a tiny, blocky humanoid shape lying face down in the gutter. As the mouse walked past it, the character didn't look down. It just kept its head buried in its chest. Arthur's eyes began to ache from the glare of the light table. He decided to leave the scanner running to digitize the remaining 7 minutes of the reel while he went up to the street level to get a coffee. Outside, the Los Angeles night was unseasonably humid. The air tasted of exhaust and asphalt. As Arthur walked toward the 24-hour diner at the corner, he couldn't shake the rhythm of the mouse's walk from his head. Step, drag, step, drag. It was an unnatural gait, one that required an intentional misaligning of the pelvis. He found himself mimicking it unconsciously, his leather soles scuffing the concrete. When he returned to the basement 40 minutes later, the air in the vault had turned freezing cold. The compressor on the ventilation unit was shrieking, a high, metallic whine that set his teeth on edge. He hurried back to his desk. The Steinbeck had stopped. The film had jammed in the gate, the hot bulb cooking the celluloid. "Damn it," Arthur hissed, reaching for the power switch. Before his fingers could touch the toggle, the scanner screen flickered. The digital capture software was still running, but it wasn't displaying a frozen frame. The video was advancing, despite the mechanical rollers being completely stationary. The cartoon had changed. The city street was gone. The background was now a flat, featureless gray texture that shimmered with digital noise. The mouse was still walking, but its pace had doubled. Its head was no longer down. It was looking directly at the viewer, its large, black eyes perfectly circular, devoid of any light reflection. The smile had altered. In the early frames, the mouth had been a simple, curved line. Now it was stretched upward toward the ears, the corners sharp and jagged. It wasn't an expression of joy. It was the rictus grin of a corpse whose facial muscles had contracted after death. The audio had evolved too. The low hum had given way to a wet, choking sound, like someone trying to breathe through a mouth full of gravel. Beneath that sound, faint but distinct, was a woman's voice crying. It wasn't an actor's sob. It was a raw, primal wail of grief, recorded with terrible clarity. Arthur grabbed the edges of the metal table, his knuckles turning white. The cold in the room was so intense now that his breath formed a thick gray fog over the screen. "David?" he called out, his voice shaking. He knew David was gone, but the silence of the basement felt too heavy to bear alone. The screen flashed. A single frame appeared, replacing the mouse. It was a real photograph. The resolution was terrible, grainy, and high contrast, but Arthur could make out the interior of a small, wood-paneled room. In the center, hanging from a thick water pipe near the ceiling, was a man. His legs were straight, his feet dangling inches above a knocked-over chair. His face was entirely obscured by a handmade papier-mâché mask of the mouse, a crude, lumpy thing with hollowed-out eyes. The screen snapped to black. The editing table clicked off. Arthur stood in the dark, the echo of that woman's wail still ringing in his eardrums. The stench of wet feathers was so thick now that he had to pull his collar over his nose to keep from gagging. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light sliced through the cold fog of the room. It illuminated his desk, the chemical trays, the empty canisters. Then the light caught the edge of the flatbed scanner. The mystery reel was gone from the spindles. Arthur dropped his phone, the device clattering against the concrete floor, its beam pointing toward the baseboards. He fell to his knees, searching the floor with his hands. His fingers brushed against something cold and wet. It wasn't film. It was a trail of dark fluid on the concrete, starting from the base of the editing table and winding its way toward the back of the archive, where the uncatalogued pallets from the old estates were stored in the dark. Paranoia, cold and absolute, gripped his chest. He felt an intense, burning pressure behind his eyes, as if his own skull were growing too tight for his brain. Someone is in here, his mind screamed. Someone is playing a prank. But the rational part of him, the part that worked with history and facts, knew that no human being could have removed that film from the gate without the sound of the plastic snaps releasing. He picked up his phone, the light shivering in his hand, and followed the dark trail. The archive stretched back into the gloom, a labyrinth of steel shelves holding thousands of forgotten stories. As he walked, the sound began. It didn't come from his phone or from any speaker. It was a physical sound, originating from the shadows ahead of him. Step, drag, the scuff of rubber on concrete. Arthur stopped, shielding the light with his hand. "Who's there?" His voice cracked. "The facility is locked. The police are on their way." It was a lie, but it was the only shield he had left. The sound stopped. From the darkness between two rows of film racks, a small, black shape moved. It didn't run. It simply leaned out into the periphery of the flashlight's beam. It was roughly 4 feet tall. The skin, if it was skin, was a matte, lightless black that seemed to absorb the light from his phone. The head was perfectly round, topped by 2 large, fleshy discs that twitched with a wet, leather-like sound. It had no clothes, no white buttons, no yellow shoes. Just a naked, skeletal frame that didn't seem to have any bones in its joints. It was smiling. The mouth was a jagged, raw tear in the black flesh, stretching from one side of the face to the other, exposing a gray, spongy mass inside that looked like old insulation foam. The thing looked up at Arthur. Its eyes were 2 hollow wells, but deep inside them, Arthur could see his own reflection. Not as he was now, but as he would look months from now, pale, emaciated, sitting in a dark room with a rope around his neck. The voice that came out of the entity wasn't a sound at all. It was an injection of pure, unfiltered despair straight into Arthur's consciousness. It didn't use words. It used a memory, the memory of the day his mother died in the hospital, the specific, exact sound of the heart monitor flattening, mixed with the realization that he was entirely alone in a universe that didn't care about his suffering. Arthur fell against the steel shelves, a row of aluminum film canisters clattering to the floor around him like tin cans. He couldn't breathe. The pressure in his chest was immense, his heart skipping beats, trying to match the irregular, dead rhythm of that piano key from the audio track. The creature stepped forward. Step, drag. Its left foot was twisted backward, the ankle broken, dragging behind it like a dead weight. It reached out a long, three-fingered hand toward Arthur's face. The fingers were wet, dripping that same yellow, nitrate-scented grease onto the concrete. "No," Arthur choked out, his vision tunneling into blackness. "Please." The entity didn't stop. It leaned in close, its breath carrying the sweet, sickening odor of old, decaying paper and formaldehyde. The jagged smile widened until the skin at the corners of its mouth split, leaking a dark, thick fluid that didn't drop, but hung in long, shivering threads. Pressed one wet, black finger against Arthur's forehead. The world didn't end in a scream. It ended in a dissolve. David arrived at the archive at 7:30 the next morning, carrying 2 cups of black coffee. The humidity from the night before had given way to a crisp, bright morning, but the moment he stepped out of the elevator into the basement, he felt a strange, lingering chill. "Arthur?" he called out, setting the coffees on the reception desk. The archive was silent. The ventilation system was working normally, its low hum the only sound in the facility. David walked back to the restoration lab. The lights were on. On the Steinbeck editing table, a canister of film sat open, its lid resting beside it. The film inside was completely blank, a long, transparent ribbon of clear acetate, devoid of any image, any sprocket holes, or any sound strip. It looked as though it had never been exposed to light at all. "Arthur." David walked toward the back rows, his shoes clicking against the clean concrete floor. He found Arthur sitting in his desk chair in the middle of the 3rd row of shelves. The chair had been turned around to face the dark wall. "Hey, did you stay here all night?" David asked, stepping closer. "You look." He stopped. Arthur was motionless. His arms hung straight down at his sides, his fingers stiff and gray. He was wearing his white restoration gloves, but the fabric had been torn away at the fingertips, his nails raw and bleeding from where he had been scratching at the steel shelving. He was smiling. It wasn't an expression David had ever seen on his boss's face. Arthur's mouth had been pulled back so far that the skin at the corners of his lips had torn, the wounds crusty with dried, dark blood. His teeth were locked together in a tight, mechanical grin that exposed his gums. His eyes were wide open, staring at the blank brick wall 2 inches in front of him. They were entirely black. The irises and pupils had dilated so completely that no white remained, leaving only 2 glossy, void-like spheres that reflected the harsh fluorescent light overhead. David backed away, his hand flying to his mouth, his coffee spilling across the concrete. "Arthur. Oh God, Arthur." He ran back to the desk to call for an ambulance, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the phone twice. The police arrived 20 minutes later, followed by a medical examiner who noted that Arthur's death was due to sudden, massive cardiac arrest, likely brought on by an underlying condition, though the rigor mortis had set in with an unnatural, terrifying speed. They wheeled the body out through the service elevator. David stayed behind to lock up the facility, his mind a blank space of shock and confusion. Before he left, he went back into the restoration room to turn off the equipment. He reached for the switch on the Steinbeck table, but his eyes caught the small digital preview monitor attached to the scanning rig. The software was closed, but the screen wasn't dark. Against the gray background of the idle monitor, a tiny, low-resolution icon was moving. It was a silhouette of a man walking. The stride was broken, 1 foot dragging behind the other in a rhythmic 6-frame loop. The head was tucked down toward the chest, the shoulders slumped in an eternal cycle of exhaustion. David reached out and pulled the main breaker switch on the wall, cutting the power to the entire room. The monitor didn't go out. The small, gray figure kept walking, passing the same 6 empty buildings over and over again in the dark, its silent, broken stride continuing long after the lights had faded into nothing.